folks. Welcome to Classical Rhetoric and Rhetorical Analysis. Whenever we write, whether it's an email to a friend or a toast for a wedding, maybe an English essay or a resume, we face some kind of rhetorical situation. We have a purpose, a certain audience, a particular stance, a genre, and a medium to consider, and often is not a design. All are important elements that we need to think about carefully. Before we can consider the ways in which the rhetorical appeals work, we must first understand what rhetoric is. There are many commonly used definitions, but for our purposes, rhetoric refers to the following: the art of persuasion, the study of the art of persuasion, or an individual act of persuasion. Rhetoric is the study of how writers and speakers use words to influence an audience. A rhetorical analysis is an essay that breaks a work of nonfiction into parts and then explains how the parts work together to create a certain effect, whether that be to persuade, to entertain, or to inform. A rhetorical analysis should explore the rhetorician's goals, the techniques or tools they are using, and the examples of those techniques, not to mention the effectiveness of those techniques. When writing a rhetorical analysis, you are not saying whether or not you agree with the argument. Instead, a rhetorical analysis explores how the rhetorician makes their argument and evaluates whether or not the approach used is successful for convincing their intended audience of their message. We'll do in our rhetorical analysis, there are two parties to be concerned with: the rhetor, the party that's attempting to persuade, and the audience. The audience is the party that the target of the persuasion. Our role will be that of analyst, where we observe the interaction between the rhetor and the audience. We'll consider ourselves to be a third party, the observer. We're not being persuaded, we are not persuading, we're just observing the interaction between the rhetor and the audience. Now, here are some mistakes to avoid. It's important for you to remember that rhetorical analysis requires you, the observer, to refrain from being a part in what's going on between the rhetor and the audience. You are the silent third party. It's not your job to decide if you are persuaded by the rhetor. Instead, it's your job to decide if the audience would be persuaded by the rhetor. Sometimes you have a very specific idea of who the audience is, but sometimes you just have a general idea. So take that into consideration. In other words, Aristotle argues that there are three elements of the art of persuasion. Ethos, that is, the rhetor is perceived by the audience as credible or not. Pathos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by making them feel certain emotions. And logos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by the use of arguments that they will perceive as logical. On the modes of persuasion provided through speech, there are three species. For some are in the character of the speaker, and some are in disposing the listener in some way, and some in the argument itself by showing or seeming to show something. And that's what Aristotle said on rhetoric. So we can see he refers to the character of the speaker, which would correspond with ethos. He refers to pathos by disposing the listener in some way, and logos by showing or seeming to show something. Look a bit more closely at Aristotle's rhetorical appeals. Ethos, the rhetor is perceived by the audience as credible or not. Pathos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by making them feel certain emotions. And logos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by use of the arguments that they will perceive as logical. We call these three elements rhetorical appeals. It's not necessary for every act of persuasion to make use of all three appeals. Often, however, there is some element of each. In academic writing, ethos and logos are given more respect than pathos. An essay that relies primarily on pathos with little use of ethos or logos is unlikely to be perceived by an academic audience as persuasive. Note that this is very different from our usual understanding of the word ethical. Ethos is used to describe the audience's perception of the rhetor's credibility or authority. The audience asks themselves, what does this person know about this topic? And why should I trust this person? There are two kinds of ethos. Extrinsic ethos, which refers to the character, expertise, education, and experience of the rhetor, and I'll get into that a little bit more deeply here in a moment. And intrinsic, how the rhetor writes or speaks, so how they're presenting the information. Okay, so let's go back to extrinsic a little bit. So I'm going to give you an example out of sports. Hopefully this will help. So say you're a successful professional basketball player, like Michael Jordan, for example. Talking about basketball to other pro athletes, your ethos is really strong with that particular audience, even before you open your mouth or even take out your pen. Your audience assumes that you're knowledgeable about your subject because of your experience. Now, if you are instead a baseball player talking about basketball, then your extrinsic ethos is not as strong because you haven't played pro basketball, but you're still a professional athlete and know something about that kind of life. However, if you're a college professor of English, then your extrinsic ethos is likely to be pretty weak with your audience. They might assume that you know nothing about basketball or about professional sports in general. Change your audience around, however, and the ethos of each hypothetical rhetor might change. An audience of preschool kids, for example, would have no idea who Michael Jordan is, and so his extrinsic ethos would be weaker with the audience than with the audience of other pro athletes. Examples of intrinsic ethos. We'll go back to the sports. So let's say you're that professional basketball player and you start to address your audience when suddenly you stutter and mumble and you use the wrong sports terminology or you mispronounce the terminology and you stare at your shoes the entire time you're talking. Suddenly your overall ethos takes a nosedive with your audience and you become less persuasive. They conclude that regardless of your experience, the way you're expressing yourself reveals that you're not someone to be taken seriously. At the other extreme, let's say you're that hypothetical English professor and you speak with confidence and use all of the correct sports-based terminology. You look around at the faces of your audience as you speak and project your voice to the back of the room. Your overall ethos, which was weak to begin with because the audience was skeptical of what an English professor would know about sports, suddenly gets stronger. It gets stronger because the intrinsic ethos goes up in the eyes of the audience. The way that a rhetor speaks or writes will also affect ethos. Intrinsic ethos is strong when the rhetor expresses herself confidently and intelligently using language that is appropriate for the audience. When we discuss the ethos of the rhetor, we decide whether it is strong or weak. We might use a phrase like, his extrinsic ethos is strong because, or his intrinsic ethos is strong, but his intrinsic ethos is weak because. Now, some mistakes to avoid. You must evaluate how the audience is likely to perceive the rhetor. When a rhetor uses information from someone else as a source to support their argument, that's an example of logos. It's the strategy of testimony and authority. Students sometimes confuse the two because in both cases, the credibility and authority of the person speaking or writing is important. However, there's a real important difference. When the rhetor is known by their audience to be experienced and an expert on the topic, their extrinsic ethos is strong. When the rhetor cites someone else who is experienced and an expert, that's an example of logos because the rhetor is using the strategy of testimony and authority. Okay, so pathos, the pathetic appeal. Note that this is very different from our usual understanding of the word pathetic. If the rhetor can create a common sense of identity with their audience, then the rhetor is using a pathetic appeal. So if that college English professor that I was talking about before mentions having played basketball in high school and convinces the audience that she or he were actually pretty good, then not only does that fact strengthen the rhetor's ethos, it also makes a pathetic appeal. This is also why so many politicians will open their speeches with "my fellow Americans." This is why many of them use the phrase "my friends" and so on when speaking to their audiences. It's a pathetic appeal. Think about different emotions people are capable of feeling. They include love, pity, sorrow, affection, anger, fear, greed, lust, hatred. The list could just go on and on. If a rhetor tries to make an audience feel any of those emotions in response to what is being said, then they're using pathos. Okay, so let's look at an example. Let's say a rhetor is trying to convince an audience of middle-class Americans to donate money to a hurricane relief fund. The rhetor can make pathetic appeals to an audience's feelings of love, pity, fear, maybe even anger. And the extent to which any of these emotions will be successfully engaged, of course, will vary from audience to audience. So we can see that love will be felt if the audience can be made to believe in their fundamental connections to other human beings. Pity might be felt if the plight of homeless hurricane victims can be made vivid to the audience. Fear might be felt if the audience can be made to imagine what they would feel like in that homeless victim's place. And anger will be felt if the audience realizes how little has been done by those who are responsible for helping. If a rhetor is clearly angry about the topic being addressed, for example, that should not be taken as pathetic. However, if the rhetor is clearly trying to make the audience feel angry, then that should be considered a pathetic appeal. And whether or not the audience does in fact feel the emotions in question, the observer can still recognize when the rhetor is using a pathetic appeal. Sometimes the pathetic appeal is weak, meaning it probably won't succeed, and sometimes the pathetic appeal is quite strong, meaning it probably will succeed. So mistakes to avoid. The emotions we are talking about here are emotions that might be felt by the audience, not felt by the rhetor. It's a very important distinction to be made here. Okay, logos, the logical appeal. Logos is the use of strategies of logic to persuade your audience. If a statement attempts to persuade the audience by making a reasonable claim and offering proof in support of that claim, rather than by trying to make them feel certain emotions or by making them perceive the speaker as credible, then that statement is a logical argument. A statement does not have to be considered logical to be a logical appeal. As an observer, you can recognize that the rhetor is attempting to use logos to persuade the audience, but that recognition doesn't mean the rhetor is succeeding. We use the term logos to describe what kind of rhetorical appeal is being made, not to evaluate whether or not an appeal makes sense to us as observers or to the audience being addressed. The basics of philosophy, logic, from the Greek word logos, is the study of reasoning, or the study of the principles and criteria of valid inference and demonstration. Logic has a variety of meanings, including word, thought, idea, argument, account, reason, or principle. Logic is a pretty big field of study. We're only going to touch on a few ideas about logical fallacy in this particular lecture. However, in your weekly lessons folders, you should find plenty of additional information on logic itself to help fill in the gaps for you. So let's look at our first example. The first example of logical fallacy that we'll look at is called cause or consequence. This is a claim about one thing causing another or one thing being caused by another. I've got a few examples. Global warming is caused by greenhouse gases being produced by humankind. So this is a claim where we're seeing one thing is causing another. Or the current economic crisis was caused primarily by deregulation of the financial industry. That would be another cause or consequence claim. Another example would be the argument, if the government gets involved in providing health insurance to the American people, we will see a sharp decline in the quality of our medical care. So we're simply looking at the structure of this argument, not the validity of the argument, not if you think, hey, yeah, this is right on or not. It's merely about, this is the structure of this particular sentence. It's cause or consequence. Analogy. An analogy is making a claim about the qualities of one thing using a comparison with another thing. For example, the ozone layer of the atmosphere is like the outer layer of skin on the human body, and if it goes away, planet Earth will be in a lot of pain. So that would be an analogy, claiming the qualities of the ozone layer is like skin on the human body. Another example might be going to that class is about as exciting as watching paint dry. You are relating the feeling you have, the excited feeling you have, or lack thereof, I guess, about relating going to class with watching paint dry. So this, again, a claim about the qualities of one thing using a comparison with another thing. Again, this is a structure of a sentence, a structure of an argument. The next possible logical fallacy, testimony and authority. This is a claim that involves citing the opinion of someone other than the rhetor, someone respected by the audience. Example, 4 of 5 dentists surveyed would recommend sugarless gum to their patients who chew gum. That's a Trident gum advertisement. And you can see that they're using the fallacy of testimony and authority, claiming that these 4 out of 5 dentists would recommend sugarless gum. You could also say, how bad is the current financial mess? According to Alan Greenspan, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman, it's the type of wrenching financial crisis that comes along only once in a century. Clearly that example is outdated. I'm going to have to update this for my next presentation. Okay, the next thing is a definition. So this is a claim about the meaning or nature of something. You could say last year's Super Bowl game was extremely boring. Or try to redefine something that already has a set definition. A syllogism. A syllogism is a claim using deductive logic involving a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. This goes from the general to the specific. So an example of this could be nuclear power plants generate dangerous nuclear waste. The new power plant that they're planning to build in our community is a nuclear power plant. So the new power plant will be dangerous. Okay, you're using a premise. Here, the premise is nuclear power plants generate dangerous nuclear waste. You're using then a minor premise. The nuclear power plant they're planning to build in our community is a nuclear power plant. That is a minor premise. And then they draw the conclusion from those 2 premises. So the new power plant will be dangerous. Okay, so this is again a structure of an argument. It could be true or it could be false, but either way it would be written in this particular fashion. I'm looking at my other examples and they are so outdated. I think the first example is great. We're just going to stick with that. If you need further examples, please consult the supplementary materials provided in the weekly lessons folders. Okay, another one would be supporting a generalization with examples. This is a claim using inductive logic where a general statement about something is backed up by specific examples. Okay, so I'm going to give you one of these examples, though it is quite, it's outdated. You need to update. But hopefully you'll be able to see the forest for the trees, and let's just go with it. In the second presidential debate of 2008, then Senator Barack Obama, argued that the United States should maintain good relations with other nations in order to make the best use of our own military resources in a time of economic constraint. He then illustrated his general statement with this specific example. Let's take the example of Darfur just for a moment. Right now, there's a peacekeeping force that has been set up, and we have African Union troops in Darfur to stop a genocide that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. We could be providing logistical support, setting up a no-fly zone at relatively little cost to us, but we can only do it if we can help mobilize the international communities as a lead. So here he made a generalization talking about how to best use our military resources in a time of economic constraint, and then used a very specific example, like the Darfur example, to back up the claim. Now, this is something you have to watch out for. This is something that politicians will do, absolutely. So, those are a few things to look out for as far as logical fallacy and logic is concerned when you're doing a rhetorical analysis. Again, if you want more on that, please consult the weekly lesson folders. There are many ways of making logical arguments. Here are a few common strategies. Remember, when you're engaged in rhetorical analysis, you are an observer of the interaction between the rhetor and the audience. So it's not your job to decide whether or not an argument is logical. Instead, it's your job to decide whether or not an argument will be believable and logical to an audience. So you might choose to combine the three rhetorical appeals. Seldom is any one statement an example of only one appeal. In the work we'll do in our rhetorical analysis, there are two parties to be concerned with, the rhetor and the audience. This statement, for example, combines all three appeals. I have to tell you that if you don't stop smoking, you're going to die, said the doctor to the patient. So the extrinsic ethos here, of course, is the rhetor is the doctor, so presumably an expert on the subject in question. The pathos here is attempting to make the audience feel fear, or that patient feel fear of death, and the logos is using the strategy of cause or consequence. If you do this, this is going to happen. Remember, it's not necessary for every act of persuasion to make use of all three appeals. Often, however, there is some element of each. Okay, so in summary, is defined for our purposes as the art of persuasion, also the study of the art of persuasion, or an individual act of persuasion. So it could be a political statement you're making, it could be an article you're writing, any sort of individual act of persuasion. Could be a speech, could be written. We also have to remember the rhetor and the audience, and in the work that we'll do in our rhetorical analyses, these are the two parties we're going to be concerned with. The rhetor is the party that's attempting to persuade, so that's the author or the speaker, depending, and the audience is the target of that persuasion. And then in any rhetorical analysis, we are considering ourselves to be a third party. We're the observers. We're not being persuaded, we're not persuading, we're just observing the interaction between the rhetor and the audience. At the heart of a rhetorical appeals, there are three elements to the art of persuasion as defined by Aristotle, as we mentioned earlier. Ethos, which is where the rhetor is perceived by the audience as credible. Pathos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by making them feel certain emotions. And logos, the rhetor attempts to persuade the audience by the use of arguments that they'll perceive as logical. Rhetoric is the study of how writers and speakers use words to influence an audience. A rhetorical analysis is an essay that breaks up a work of nonfiction into parts and then explains how the parts work together to create a certain effect, whether that's to persuade, to entertain, or to inform. Remember, when writing a rhetorical analysis, you are not saying whether you agree with or not with the argument. Instead, you're exploring how the rhetorician makes their argument and you evaluate whether or not the approach that they're using is successful in convincing their intended audience of their message. Evaluate the piece in terms of classical rhetoric and analyze the piece in question as far as logical appeals go. That should be everything. If you reach out. Have a nice day.